John had always considered his house a sanctuary, a quiet refuge tucked into the neatly trimmed rows of Maplewood estates. Every morning, he'd sip his coffee on the porch, watching squirrels dart between trees and neighbors greet each other with warm smiles. But that peaceful routine shattered the moment he stepped through his front door that day. Taped to the door was a stark white envelope, official-looking and stamped with the HOA seal. His name was typed in bold letters, followed by a chilling headline, "Notice of Eviction." John's heart skipped. His hands trembled slightly as he peeled the notice from the door. The paper was crisp, formal, and brutal in its tone. It was signed by Karen Matthews, the HOA president, known throughout the community as a force to be reckoned with. No one liked her. At every meeting, she wielded her power like a judge with a gavel, often humiliating homeowners over trivial infractions. But eviction, that was something new, something terrifying. The letter accused John of violating multiple HOA regulations, none of which he had ever been told about before. The accusations were vague: unauthorized modifications, failure to comply with landscaping standards, and harboring guests beyond permitted limits. John blinked in disbelief. Over the past year, he'd followed every rule to the letter. His lawn was immaculate, his home's exterior untouched, and guests? His family visits were always short and infrequent. But the kicker was the deadline: vacate the premises within 30 days, or legal action will follow. The words felt like a knife twisting in his gut. How could Karen do this? Why target him, of all people? John sank onto his porch swing, the eviction notice crumpled in his hands. A cold dread crept up his spine. Something wasn't right. This was no ordinary HOA dispute. It felt personal. And worse, it felt like a trap. Later that evening, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. Karen had called an emergency HOA meeting, rumors swirling about a major shakeup. John decided he had no choice but to attend. He needed answers, or at least to face Karen and understand her true motive. The community center was packed, every chair filled with anxious homeowners. Karen sat at the head of the table, her expression icy, her posture rigid. As John stepped forward, a hush fell over the crowd. "You all know why we're here," Karen began, her voice sharp and cold. "Mr. John Smith has flagrantly violated our community guidelines and must be removed immediately." Murmurs rippled through the room. John noticed how Karen's eyes locked onto his with something deeper than authority, something almost personal. "I'm willing to discuss this calmly," John said, steady despite the rising tension. "But I'd like specific details on these supposed violations." Karen's lips curled into a smirk. "Details? They're documented. You've ignored every notice. This is the final warning." John's gaze swept across the room, seeing neighbors' curious and concerned faces. Then, without breaking eye contact with Karen, he spoke quietly but firmly. "You don't know the half of it, Karen." A flicker of surprise flashed across her face before she masked it with contempt. The crowd leaned in, their curiosity ignited. What did John mean? What secrets could he possibly be hiding? As the meeting adjourned, John left with more questions than answers. One thing was certain: this eviction notice was just the beginning. Somewhere beneath the polished lawns and painted fences, a darker truth lurked, and John was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for a chilly Thursday evening. John arrived early, the weight of the eviction notice heavy on his shoulders. He knew this wasn't going to be just another routine gathering of homeowners. The air in the community center was thick with quiet whispers and sideways glances. Word traveled fast in Maplewood Estates, and everyone was eager to witness the showdown between John and Karen. As the room filled, John spotted familiar faces. Neighbors who had always been polite but distant, now watching him with thinly veiled curiosity. He spotted Mrs. Hernandez, the elderly woman with a sharp tongue, and Mr. Lee, who always seemed neutral but never missed a meeting. But all eyes were drawn to Karen Matthews, seated confidently at the head of the table, her arms crossed like a queen defending her throne. Karen's icy gaze fixed on John the moment he entered. There was no warmth in it, only the cold certainty of someone who believed they had all the power. The meeting began with the usual announcements, but tension hung like a cloud over the room. When Karen's turn came, she wasted no time. "Let's address the elephant in the room," she announced, voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Mr. John Smith has repeatedly violated the HOA's community standards. His blatant disregard for the rules threatens the harmony of this neighborhood." A few neighbors nodded, but many looked skeptical. John's heart pounded, but he kept his expression calm. Karen continued, laying out her accusations: unauthorized modifications to his property, failure to maintain landscaping, and hosting guests beyond the permitted limit. But John knew none of this was true. When it was his turn, John stood slowly, his voice steady but firm. "Karen, I've lived here for over 10 years. I've never received any official notice of violations until this eviction notice. I'm happy to discuss any concerns, but this sudden demand to leave without clear evidence is unjust and feels personal." Karen's smile was thin and sharp. "The records don't lie, John. The violations were documented months ago, and you ignored every letter." John's eyes scanned the room, noticing some neighbors exchanging uncertain looks. He realized he needed to shift the momentum. "Karen," he said quietly but with weight, "you're mistaken about those records. I never received any letters, and I have reasons to believe this eviction is more about something else entirely." Murmurs rippled across the crowd. Karen's jaw tightened, her fingers curling around the edge of the table. John leaned in slightly. "You don't know the half of it, Karen." The room fell into an uneasy silence, eyes locked on Karen to see how she'd respond. Her voice dropped but carried a dangerous edge. "Careful, John. Accusations without proof can have consequences." John nodded, not intimidated. Maybe it's time for some truths to come out. The meeting ended with no clear resolution. Some neighbors approached John afterward, whispering their doubts about Karen's leadership. Others warned him to tread carefully. Outside, the night air was crisp as John walked to his car. His mind raced. Something about Karen's sudden, aggressive eviction attempt didn't add up. It was as if she was hiding something that connected directly to him. Determined, John resolved to investigate the HOA records himself. He would find out what Karen was really trying to protect. Whatever it was big enough for her to throw him out of the only home he'd ever known. As he drove away, John couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a battle that would change the neighborhood and his life forever. That night, John sat at his kitchen table, the eviction notice still lying face down beside his laptop. The glow from the screen illuminated the lines of worry etched across his face. Something about Karen's sudden crusade felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. Pieces John was determined to find. He opened the county's online property records, fingers hovering over the keyboard as he searched for his home's parcel number. The documents were dense, filled with legal jargon, but John had always been good with details. After several clicks and scrolling through pages, his eyes caught something odd. The title to the land beneath his house wasn't just in his name. It was owned by a family trust established decades ago, one he had helped set up years back, though he hadn't realized it included the entire neighborhood's land parcels. Curious, John dug deeper. He pulled up maps, historical ownership data, and legal filings. Then came the shock. One parcel, marked as Karen's address, was listed under that same trust, the very trust John controlled. His heart pounded. How could Karen be living in a house she didn't own? More importantly, how had she managed to wield power over the HOA for so long without anyone realizing this? John printed the documents, his mind racing with questions. Was Karen illegally occupying the property? Had she built her influence on a lie? And if so, why was she suddenly targeting him? The next morning, John decided to confront a few trusted neighbors who had been around longer than he had. At the local cafe, he met with Mrs. Hernandez and Mr. Lee. They exchanged nervous glances as John shared his discovery. "I never knew," Mrs. Hernandez said, lowering her voice. "Karen always acted like she owned everything here. She's been controlling. We never questioned it." Mr. Lee nodded grimly. "There have been whispers. Some say she dodges property taxes and fines, but who dares stand up to her?" John felt a flicker of hope. If others knew about Karen's questionable claims, maybe he wasn't alone in this fight. Back home, as John sifted through his papers, his phone buzzed with an anonymous text, "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." His blood ran cold. Karen wasn't just a petty HOA president. She was dangerous. But John's resolve hardened. He wouldn't be bullied out of his home by someone who had been living on borrowed ground for years. That evening, John returned to the community center, this time with printed deeds, maps, and legal excerpts. The next HOA meeting was in 2 days. He planned to drop a bombshell. As he prepared, John reflected on how the neighborhood had been under Karen's thumb for so long. Neighbors too scared or too uninformed to question her rule. Now, armed with proof, John was ready to turn the tables. But deep down, he knew this wouldn't be easy. Karen's reaction could be unpredictable, maybe even ruthless. Still, the stakes were too high to back down. John's fight wasn't just about his home anymore. It was about the truth and the future of Maplewood Estates. The day of the HOA meeting arrived faster than John expected. The community center buzzed with an undercurrent of tension. Neighbors gathered, whispering and glancing nervously at Karen, who arrived with her usual cold confidence. But something was different. Her eyes flickered briefly with something unspoken, maybe unease. John took a deep breath as he set up the stack of documents on the conference table. The room fell silent as he began to speak. "I've done some research," he announced, voice steady, "and I found something important about property ownership in our neighborhood." Karen's gaze snapped to him, sharp and wary. John continued, "The land where Karen Matthews' house stands isn't legally hers. It's part of a trust that I control, the same trust that owns my home." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Some neighbors exchanged shocked glances, others just stared, unsure what to believe. Karen's face hardened instantly. "That's a blatant lie," she snapped. "You have no proof." John slid a thick packet across the table toward her. "The county records don't lie. Here are deeds, tax documents, and legal filings." I didn't want to believe it either, but the truth is clear. Karen's jaw clenched. She leaned forward, voice low but venomous. "You don't understand what you're meddling with, John. I've been here for years. I built this community." Mrs. Hernandez, sitting near the back, raised her hand. "But Karen, if these records are true, doesn't that mean you've been living here illegally?" Karen's eyes flashed with anger. "I pay my dues like everyone else. This is harassment." John felt the room shift as Karen's loyalists began whispering among themselves. It was clear Karen had spent years weaving a web of lies and control. He wasn't just fighting an eviction. He was challenging a reign built on deceit. Just then, an elderly neighbor stood. "I've lived here longer than most of you," he said quietly. "And I remember when Karen first moved in. She never showed any paperwork, always said it wasn't important." Whispers spread like wildfire. Karen's facade started to crack. As the meeting continued, John received a subtle warning from a stranger in the back, a quick nod and a whispered, "Be careful. Karen's not just an HOA president, she's dangerous." Outside, John spotted a familiar car parked suspiciously nearby. He noted the license plate, but didn't approach. Whoever was watching him wanted to intimidate him. It only fueled his determination. Later that evening, John stopped by a local title company. The clerk there confirmed everything he'd found online. Karen's property wasn't registered under her name. Instead, it was tied to the trust John controlled. Armed with this new confirmation, John felt the stakes climbing higher. Karen wasn't just risking losing her home. She might face legal consequences for fraud and tax evasion. But would the neighbors stand with him, or would Karen's fear tactics silence them? As John drove home through the quiet streets of Maplewood Estates, he glanced at the glow from Karen's house. The woman who tried to evict him was sitting on borrowed ground, but she still held power, and she wasn't going down without a fight. John knew the next move had to be smart, decisive, because Karen's web of lies was tighter than anyone imagined. And the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous this game would become. The tension between John and Karen had been simmering for weeks, but it finally boiled over one sweltering Saturday afternoon. John stood outside Karen's house, clutching the stack of ownership documents tightly. He decided it was time for a direct confrontation. The neighborhood had waited long enough. Karen needed to face the truth. Karen stepped out of her front door as John approached, her usual cold, confident smile replaced by a sharp glare. "What do you want, John?" she asked, voice dripping with thinly veiled hostility. John held up the papers. "This," he said simply. "All of it. The deeds, the county records, everything that proves I own this property, including your house." Karen's eyes narrowed. "You're bluffing." John shook his head. "I'm not. I've given the HOA proof. The neighbors know. You've been living here illegally. This isn't just about the eviction notice anymore. It's about the truth." Karen's jaw clenched. "You don't get to threaten me." "I'm not threatening you," John replied calmly. "I'm giving you a chance to do the right thing before this goes to court. It's not too late." For a long moment, Karen said nothing. Then, her face twisted with fury. "You think you can just take my house away from me? I built this community, and you're going to destroy everything with your lies." John met her glare evenly. "I didn't destroy anything. You did, by living on property you don't own, by forcing neighbors to live in fear of your punishments, by hiding behind fake fines and forged documents." Karen stepped closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You don't know what you're messing with. If you push this, it won't just be a legal battle, it'll get ugly." John's grip on the papers tightened. "I'm ready for that. I won't be bullied or intimidated anymore." Karen laughed bitterly, then abruptly turned and slammed the door shut. John stood there, the weight of her words lingering in the hot summer air. She was dangerous. That much was clear. But he wasn't backing down. That evening, John returned home, where his phone buzzed relentlessly. Texts from unknown numbers warned him to stop digging, threatening legal action and worse. But John refused to be silenced. Meanwhile, Karen began rallying her loyal supporters. At the next HOA meeting, she painted John as a troublemaker, someone trying to tear the neighborhood apart. But with the documents John shared, the cracks in her story were becoming impossible to ignore. Neighbors who had once feared Karen started to question her authority. Small groups whispered in backyards, wondering how long Karen had been hiding the truth. John's resolve strengthened. This was no longer just about his home. It was about exposing a long-standing injustice and reclaiming the community from a woman who had ruled through fear and deception. But John also knew the stakes had risen dramatically. Karen's threats weren't empty. Something darker was lurking beneath her smile, and it was coming for him next. John had barely slept since his confrontation with Karen. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined her furious glare and the slam of that front door echoing in his mind. He knew this fight wasn't just legal, it was personal, and Karen wasn't the type to give up quietly. The next morning, John found his mailbox stuffed with anonymous letters. Some were thinly veiled threats, others contained cryptic warnings. One note read, "Stop digging or face the consequences." Another was worse, an old photograph of his house, marked with a red circle and the words, "Your time is running out." John's pulse quickened. Whoever was behind this wanted him scared, but the message only strengthened his resolve. Determined to stay one step ahead, John reached out to a trusted lawyer specializing in property disputes. The attorney's eyes widened as John laid out the tangled web of ownership and Karen's fraudulent claims. "This isn't just an HOA dispute," the lawyer said grimly. "If what you say is true, you have grounds for serious legal action. But be careful. People with power don't go down without a fight." John nodded. "I'm prepared for whatever comes next." Meanwhile, Karen's grip on Maplewood Estates began to slip. At the latest HOA meeting, a surprising number of residents spoke out, some sharing stories of intimidation, others questioning her authority. Even Karen's closest allies looked uneasy. But Karen wasn't defeated yet. Behind closed doors, she plotted her next move. Late one night, John noticed unfamiliar cars parked near his home. Shadows lingered at the edge of his yard. He installed security cameras and motion lights, trying to catch any signs of harassment. One evening, as John reviewed footage, he spotted a figure lurking near his fence, a woman wearing a dark hoodie, face obscured. The figure paused, looked directly at the camera, then disappeared into the night. John's hands trembled. Whoever this was, they were watching him closely. The warnings weren't empty threats. But John refused to back down. He knew exposing Karen's lies would shake the entire neighborhood and maybe even put him in danger. Yet, he was ready. Because sometimes, the only way to take back control was to face the darkness head-on. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. John, fortified by his lawyer's advice and the support of skeptical neighbors, pushed forward with his case. But the more he fought, the more Karen retaliated, not just through words, but subtle acts of intimidation that sent a chill through the community. One late afternoon, while reviewing his security footage, John noticed something strange. The woman in the hoodie from before wasn't just watching. She was meeting with someone else, a man, tall and silent, whose presence felt cold and menacing. They spoke briefly, then split up, disappearing into the shadows. John's gut told him this was no ordinary feud. Karen was pulling strings far beyond the HOA, and now it seemed she had allies willing to do her dirty work. But just when the pressure seemed unbearable, John's breakthrough came from an unexpected place. Mrs. Hernandez, the elderly neighbor who had quietly observed everything from the sidelines, invited John over for tea. "John," she began, her voice low and serious, "there's something you need to know. Something about Karen that no one else talks about." John leaned in, curiosity piqued. Mrs. Hernandez continued, "Years ago, before she moved here, Karen was involved in a scandal. Property fraud, they said. She was forced to leave her last community, but somehow managed to start fresh here. She's been hiding her past, and anyone who gets too close tends to disappear from the neighborhood." John's heart skipped a beat. "Disappear," he echoed. Mrs. Hernandez nodded grimly. "People move away suddenly, no explanations, and the ones who stayed are too scared to speak." John felt the weight of the warning. Karen's threats were more than bluster. They were backed by a history of silencing opposition. Armed with this new knowledge, John knew the battle was no longer just about deeds or HOA rules. It was about exposing a woman who had built her empire on fear and lies. Determined, John doubled down on gathering evidence, legal documents, witness testimonies, anything that would hold up in court. But Karen sensed her grip slipping. The attacks escalated. Vandalism on John's property, threatening notes slipped under his door, even strange phone calls in the dead of night. Despite it all, John refused to be intimidated. One evening, as he sat reviewing his evidence, the power in his house flickered and went out. The sudden darkness was more than just a blackout. It was a message. Karen was still watching, still fighting. But John had one final card to play. The truth. And this time, it would be impossible to hide. The night of the decisive HOA meeting had arrived. The community center was packed, the air thick with anticipation and whispered speculation. John's heart pounded as he carried the last batch of evidence, documents, photos, recordings, all the proof he painstakingly gathered. Karen sat at the head of the room, her usual poise cracked by the tension. For the first time, she looked uncertain. John stepped forward, voice clear and steady. "Neighbors, I'm here not just to defend my home, but to reveal the truth about our community, about Karen Matthews, and the control she's held over us for years." He laid out everything. The county records proving Karen didn't own her house, the trust that controlled the land, the anonymous threats, the suspicious disappearances, and Mrs. Hernandez's chilling revelation about Karen's past. The room erupted in murmurs. Karen rose abruptly. "This is slander," she shouted. "You're trying to ruin me." But John held up a folder. "I also have recordings, conversations where you threatened neighbors, forged documents you submitted to the HOA, and proof you evaded property taxes." Faces turned pale as the weight of John's evidence sank in. Suddenly, the door burst open. A middle-aged woman entered, holding a thick envelope. "I'm the county auditor," she announced. "We've been investigating Ms. Matthews for months, based on reports of fraud and tax evasion. Thanks to Mr. John's evidence, we're ready to take legal action." Karen's face twisted with fury and panic. Then, the twist no one expected. The county auditor handed John a document, a deed transfer form, signed years ago by Karen unknowingly during a closed-door meeting with a fraudulent buyer. It was void, making John's trust the sole legal owner of all the land, including Karen's house. Karen's reign was over. As the crowd absorbed the truth, Karen's supporters drifted away, whispering and avoiding eye contact. John felt a rush of relief, not just for himself, but for the entire neighborhood. "This isn't just about property," John said softly. "It's about reclaiming our community from fear and deception." The HOA voted unanimously to remove Karen from her position and begin restoring trust among neighbors. In the days that followed, Karen quietly moved out, her threats silenced. Maplewood Estates began healing. And John, once targeted for eviction, became a symbol of courage and resilience. Because sometimes, the biggest battles lead to the greatest victories. And the home you fight for is more than just a place. It's where truth and justice stand tall.